Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone. This is Jim Barnes from Tutor.com. Thanks for joining us in our webinar today on Shining a Light on Obstacles, using data as a guide to student pathways. We're going to be starting in about 5 minutes, so just hold tight as more and more people join in here. You'll be able to ask questions that we will follow up on at the end of the webinar, and that will be questions that you put in the chat box on the control panel here for the GoToWebinar. So sit tight. We'll be starting in about 4 minutes. Thank you. Welcome, folks. This is Jim Barnes from Tutor.com. We have about 3 minutes to go before we start our webinar. Come on in and make yourselves comfortable. Dr. Farah will be starting in about 3 minutes. A couple housekeeping items. If you want to ask questions of Dr. Farah during the course of the webinar, please list them in the chat box. We'll have a Q&A at the end in which we will be able to get those questions answered. You will all get a recording of this presentation today, and feel free to follow up with us if there's any further questions on that. You'll see our contact information as you go through at the end of the session. And there will be a point in here where Dr. Farah will be asking the audience, what kind of data do you want to use? And you feel free to put your responses in the chat box, and I'll read them off to Dr. Farah. We'll be starting in about 2 minutes. Thank you. Okay, we're just about ready to start. My name is Jim Barnes. I'm with Tutor.com. We have a fair number of attendees here in the webinar. We're going to be starting here in just a second. Our webinar is called Shining a Light on Obstacles, using data as a guide to student pathways. And Dr. Farah, who's our head of our academic tutoring operations for Tutor.com, will be leading this presentation. This is a result of a collaborative study that she did with Ivy Tech Community College and their math department last year, and this is the result of that collaboration for that. So we urge you to ask whatever questions you will throughout the course of the webinar, and they'll collect down in the chat box, and I will answer them or ask them to Dr. Farah at the end of the session. So with that, let me introduce Dr. Farah. Cindy manages our entire operations of our academic tutoring, which includes the recruitment, onboarding, quality control, and support of over 3,300 tutors. She also has experience designing and conducting efficacy studies for a variety of assessment, professional development, and curriculum programs. She is a senior education professional with 18 years of experience in the education industry with nationally recognized accomplishments in science content development for standards, assessments, and course design. During her career, she worked for the College Board's Advanced Placement Program for over 9 years, developing AP exams, professional development, and online teacher support tools. Her research focus is on student and adult learning, and we have quite a number of adult learners in our sessions each day. Dr. Farah joined Tutor.com in June of 2015, and she received her doctorate in science education from Columbia University. Let me introduce Dr. Cynthia Farah.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you everybody for attending today. As Jim mentioned, we are shining a light on obstacles, and we're going to be using data as a guide to student pathways. So some of our focus for today is we are going to look at the Ivy Tech Community College case study, give an overview of the study, and then dive a little deeper into the challenges of the Gateway Mathematics courses, as well as look at the qualitative analysis that we conducted on some of the student comments. And then I'd like to explore with you some of the uses of the data with the various institutions we have represented in the audience. So for those of you who are not as familiar with Tutor.com, we are a 24/7 on-demand tutoring service. We use a large group, as Jim mentioned. We're currently at around 3,300 rigorously vetted community of expert of online tutors. And we are also a retention partner. We work with institutions not only to provide the best-in-class tutoring service, but also to provide the diagnostic data that can easily be plugged into any student support system. And we also have a proven record in the resource that we help institutions retain and graduate successfully more confident students. So I thought I would first kind of give a context into many institutions are challenged by student retention as well as program completion. Some are challenged with connecting their students' courses to the careers or industries in which the students are seeking. And so these institutions are seeking ways to address these issues through efficiency. So by efficiency, I mean they're really looking at creating a system of redesigning the entire student experience, where they are looking at student intake as well as any kind of structured program pathway of courses that are then aligned to careers, looking at the support structures along that pathway, and then also looking at the instruction that is ensuring that students are learning within that pathway. And they're also trying to reduce any kind of distraction or roadblock that may get in the way of students achieving course program completion. There are a lot of different student success models available, but they're all looking for effectiveness. And so they want to make sure that they have a clear path to completion and whatever the support systems they are putting in place are working. And so when they are looking at that, they are looking at making sure that students are receiving support early in their pathway. And so they are then diving into what is happening to these students early in the pathway, both academically as well as those affective aspects of learning. They also want to understand better what are the student challenges at the beginning of the pathway, but also along the pathway. So given that context, Tutor.com, because we have, at this point in time, over 16.5 million tutoring sessions, and we have data behind all those sessions, we really wanted to look at how can we use our data and look at our data in a way that would really be useful for institutions so that we can share these are the additional data that we can provide to help institutions who are using, various different student support models, but, in particular, those that are looking at a guided pathway model to inform the structure of that pathway to identify those roadblocks that are in those critical courses along the pathway. How could we help inform instruction or possibly course design? We also wanted to know how could we help identify any critical points for where students need early alerts that a student may be at risk. And so that's kind of what led to us partnering with Ivy Tech Community College to conduct a case study where we really wanted just to explore the factors that are impacting student success. So we wanted to look at both the academic aspects of learning, but also those non-cognitive elements of learning. And then we wanted to explore how institutions might use that data. So we really looked at this as a partnership in that we have the data. What do we think the institutions would want to know? Joan Rooney and I, who are the co-authors of this, along with Ben Markham from Ivy Tech, don't have a math education, as Jim explained. I'm in science education background, and so therefore we really had a very objective view to the data we're looking at. And then we worked with Ben to help us really explain the data that we found and add any kind of additional uses for the data to really kind of round out the study to say, how is this going to be meaningful to the institutions? So some of the guiding questions to the case study were, what are the greatest areas of struggle in the Gateway Mathematics courses? When do these areas of struggle occur within the course? And does online tutoring have an impact on those non-cognitive skills, in particular the confidence, persistence, and growth mindset? So give you a little bit background on the case population. We worked with the Ivy Tech student data. We initially started with the sessions for 9 community colleges that are a part of the Achieve the Dream network. So that equated to about 84,000, almost 85,000 sessions that we had in front of us. And that takes place between 2015 and 2017. We decided to focus on Ivy Tech because they do have 65,000 plus sessions. They are a statewide community college system. And looking at their demographic data, they are a population of students that we think, fit many of the institutions that are out there. So they do have more full-time than part-time. They have a larger population that is under 24. They have some online attendance, but then you also see retention rate for part-time and full-time are in the 40% and as high as 49%. But the grad rate within only 150% of the normal time is 14%. So just to give you an idea of the data sources. So at the end of every single session, our tutors complete what's called a post-session survey. And so the first 2 questions at the top you can see are more of a diagnostic that the tutor takes in terms of looking at, did the student achieve understanding? And then did the student have the appropriate prerequisite knowledge? So that gives you a sense of, were there any barriers in terms of prerequisite knowledge towards students, achieving understanding, and did the student achieve understanding in the session? We also have tutors classify the session. So there is a two-point hierarchy where we have a topic and a subtopic in which they categorize the focus of the session, and the tutor can also leave comments. And so for the purpose of this case study, we wanted to focus on the classification system, the topics and the subtopics, because we wanted to know those areas in which students were really struggling. So also another data point we had was at the end of session, students have the option to complete a survey in which they give some feedback on what they thought of their tutor in terms of excellent to poor, and so excellent being a 5 and a poor being a 1. Would they recommend this service to a friend? Are they glad the university offers it? Did they feel that this service helped them complete their homework, improve their grades, and then be more confident about their schoolwork? They also have the option to share any kind of feedback that they might want to have. And so for this case study, we did want to dive into, the number of students who answered the question about confidence, and then looking at a qualitative analysis of their comments that they left related to the session. And this is student self-reported data, and we did have about a 36% response rate from the sessions that we looked at. So looking first at all of the institutions, so when we were looking at the 84,740 sessions, we specifically zeroed in on the math. Those are often those gateway courses that are at the beginning of the pathway, and so we wanted to see where are the students struggling in that area. And so just to explain our classification system, because we are a service that offers support both in the K-12 space as well as in the higher ed space, we classify our subjects using the K-12. So you see here like algebra, algebra 2, that isn't always directly in line with, you know, college algebra, or there isn't really an algebra 2 necessarily in the college space. So we map, when we do our tutoring, the developmental courses and the college algebra to our algebra 2 tutors. So as you can see, of all these 84,000 sessions, 37% are within the area of algebra 2. So we wanted to look at those a little bit closer. Up next was then college essay writing, which should not surprise many of you, in that there were 14,000 sessions that were in college essay writing. And so I think that is a future analysis and case study. Okay, so as I mentioned, there is the topic and then the subtopic. So looking at all of those Algebra 2 sessions, we wanted to look at what are the topics that are causing students the most pain. And just to give you a sense of, or an explanation, as there's a linear functions, and then it says linear functions, equations, and inequalities. Those are the same. In 2017, when we were looking at our topic drill down for our tutors, it wasn't clear where inequalities belonged, and so we wanted to call it out. And so we have added inequalities. And so the topic list, what is contained in there, is the same. So they are considered as a part of these totals. But as you can see, linear functions, over 28.4% of the time was where the areas sought help, or where the students sought help. Quadratic equations, inequalities, and functions was the next highest at 15.8, and then exponential and logarithmic functions at 14.1. So these are the areas across all of the institutions. So we did want to spend some time, as I mentioned, then diving into Ivy Tech. So when we looked at the Ivy Tech data, this goes from 2015 to 2017. So in 2014, Ivy Tech shifted to a mathematics pathway so that their data included in this case study starting spring of 2015 does reflect the tutoring sessions of a full year after they have implemented the pathways. So in particular, we're looking at the STEM pathway, which goes from Math 23 to 100 to Math 136. Math 100 is considered an intermediate algebra, and Math 136 is a college algebra. We do have the Math 80 in here because that is considered a co-requisite course, as part of many pathways are doing, that goes along with the quantitative reasoning course that the students are taking. We have recently added quantitative reasoning tutoring, and so we're going to be looking to those numbers shortly so that we can see that dynamic between the quantitative reasoning and the co-requisite course. So again, an area of interest is the Math 136 class. 58% of the sessions for Ivy Tech are from that course. And again, if you look at what are the three topics that are the most challenging for students, we have linear functions, exponential and log functions, and quadratic functions. So again, we're kind of peeling back the onion and say, well, what's going on in Math 136? So we looked at linear function across time. And so this is looking at when do students seek out help for tutoring in Math 136. So just to orient you, because we know there aren't 152 weeks in any semester, that the September is the week 35 is the beginning of the fall semester for Ivy Tech, and we have the summer semester beginning at week 23, and then in mid-June begins the spring semester. So when looking at this data, it looks that, you know, you see a similar kind of a bump of peak around week 4 or 5 of the students, you know, really struggling with linear equations. And then it seems to kind of, you know, continue, but then have a kind of a peak tail here, which is before exam time. And you see this repeated in each semester. But I think what's interesting is that linear functions continues to be a trend, not just when it's taught, but throughout the entire course. And something that Ben brought to our attention is that in this time period, in the middle here, is where they could transition into radical expressions and equations and rational with exponents. And so this is something that is typically taught in the Math 100 class. So this should be prerequisite knowledge they have. But in order to solve those problems, they have to transform them into linear equations or quadratic equations. So he looked at the data and said, I bet the students are really struggling with the transformation, because you start seeing a peak here when typically they have moved out of linear equations. So again, this is becomes very powerful, where we have this data outside of any kind of very specific instructional materials, course information, that then the instructor can look at and really say, well, this is what I'm seeing, because I know this is the assignment that was given, and this is where the students are struggling. So they felt that they could really leverage this knowledge, this data, with the prior knowledge challenges that students are having, which then could, again, help with the pathway sequences and the types of instruction and the design of those courses. One of the other things that came out of this study is that even though they have all different instructors, they're all following the common sequence, and that they do use a typical textbook sequence for college algebra. So we looked at this in a couple different ways. This is great because now we have a baseline data in which they can say, this is what college algebra looks like when we're following the typical textbook sequence. However, they are going this year into implementing OER. So what's going to happen when they have OER in place? And so the instructors can change up the sequence, and therefore they were thinking, we have this baseline, and then we can see what's going to happen with the impact of adding OER content to this course. So then diving in a little deeper, again, we can, look at weeks 37 through 41, where we had a peak in the fall semester, and we can now look at the subtopic breakdown. And so when you dive into this data, you see the orange and the yellow, in which there you start seeing the solving of the linear equations is the big pain point for students, and then solving problems with equations. And so where those two start getting broken down is, can they actually go through the mechanics of solving it versus setting it up from word problems into kind of setting up the problem and solving it. And so we did a deeper dive into some of these sessions to say, what are the questions that the students are asking, and found just that. The students are really struggling with anything that is a word problem. And I think many of us in education know that that is a problem more broadly, all the way down into the K-12 space. So then also we wanted to look at going into the subtopics of spring. Also a similar pattern in terms of you're looking at the solving the linear equations and the word problems, but also you notice there is a change in enrollment. And so the additional perspective that Ivy Tech could give to this is that many times they encourage students to take the college algebra in the fall, because then if they need to, they can repeat it in the spring. So they do have a lower enrollment, but then also it gives you another way to comparison in terms of students' challenges, first time taking the course, second time taking the course. And so stepping back, and I like to kind of the forest through the trees analysis, this is looking at linear functions, quadratics, and exponential across the entire semester. So imagine that kind of topic drill down that we just did with linear functions could be done with quadratics as well as exponential and logarithmic functions. Always diving in a little deeper to say, where are the areas that our students having the biggest struggle? More globally, again, this is where looking at the pattern of the data, when you look at right here, the linear functions and the quadratic functions around week 40 to 45, is where you have then that radical expressions coming in. And so I think it'd be really interesting to dive into here to see what are the nature of the students' questions. And then also I think pulling in the prerequisite data that we have. And so that's another next step, is we have those indications of whether the tutor felt the student had the prerequisite knowledge. And so we would want to dive into and combine that data when looking at it. And so that is the quantitative aspect, where we answered our questions about what are students challenged with and where are they challenged. But then we also wanted to address the affective aspects of learning. And so the post-session survey, as I mentioned, has the confidence question. So Ivy Tech globally, remember they have a 36% response rate. 30% responded that responded to the competence question. 96.6% stated they were more confident. And so on average, 4.6 on a 5-point scale, rated the session highly, and they recommended the service to 97% of the cases. Math 136, again, trying to dive into that data specifically, saw a slightly higher confidence, those students stating their confidence, but also 34% responded to the confidence question. Similar average rating, and the recommend rate was slightly higher. So to do this analysis, we wanted to look at, these are the students that are saying they are more confident. Let's look at their comments and do a qualitative analysis to determine what is playing into this increase in confidence. So first, of the 98%, what are these factors? We looked at the help-seeking behavior. And so this is something that can be fostered, and this is something that students felt, left comments about. There were conditions in place where they sought help. And so this is, I think, is interesting, because I think many people, when you put in those support structures, the first, step is getting them to use those support structures. So some of the factors that we had with our tutoring that led to and kind of encouraged that help-seeking behavior is it's easy to use, it's something that's offered 24/7, it's timely, it's online, so they can access it from anywhere. And I think the timely point is very important, because we have many students accessing the service at 3 a.m., 4 a.m., 5 a.m., and so we are meeting their need when they have it. And they were very focused on their question that they had at that moment. So that was one factor that we found. We also found the most predominant one being the connection that they made with the tutor. So 57% of the comments are revolving around this respect that they had and felt for the tutor. They felt it was very personalized to their needs. They felt the tutor had so much patience and it was encouraging for them. They felt that the tutor was dedicated, was very knowledgeable, but also addressed their individual needs. So this is also one of those factors that contributed to the confidence, and also can lead to that personalized aspect of learning that leads to the motivation, connections to motivation. And then we also saw signs of a growth mindset. So there were many comments that I found as interesting where the students appreciated the change, that they were making and they had an active involvement in. It's not something that happened to them. We saw many comments where the student's comment may also be that, where they felt the tutor was doing something to them, and it wasn't really that they were actively involved in that change. There were many students that appreciate the struggle. They like learning from their mistakes. And this one is really important in that they felt accepted and supported in this safe environment. And so, I like to say that our classrooms provide a safe place to fail, because it is a place where students can learn through their mistakes and still keep going and feeling encouraged. Also, that we saw persistence was another thing that came through in many of the comments. So there was motivation to continue. Some of them just I'll stay for another week. Some of them I'm going to finish this course. Some of them, I'm going to graduate. The value of doing the work. They felt successful in their exam, or they felt successful in their course, and they wanted to continue to work at it. So these were all factors that we found through doing a qualitative analysis of the students' comments. So this is the point where I wanted to pause for a second, because I really want this to be a discussion, because I'm sure we have many different types of institutions present in the audience. And to use the chat space to really reflect on, if you had this data available to you, what would you do with it? And in thinking that, similar to how we approached it, we have this data, we can only go so far, because we don't have all the access that the institutions have to all of the student data in terms of grades and graduation, rates and things like that. So we know there's so much more that can be done. But I wanted to get a chance to really hear from you on what you had this data, what would you do with it? And Jim, I'll just allow you to kind of, as people are adding their comments, kind of read some out.
Absolutely. Share that in the chat box, and I'll report them to Cindy. At the moment, you've stumped the panel, Cindy.
Oh, no. I guess we could start in general. If we want to talk about these data, we can say, what if we want to do the student challenges data? We can separate that data from the more affective aspects, the competence data, if that kind of helps you focus your ideas.
Okay, hold on. I would use this data to justify program expansion. Is one comment so far.
All right.
Another comment is, as we get data like that, it helps us to hire and schedule face-to-face tutors appropriately, and then to consider more supports as necessary from WSSU. At our institution, we would use the data to determine how best to reach our students to ensure academic success. The data would help us determine where the struggles are and develop methods to improve the shared data with instructors so that they can use within their classroom this data. The data also would help with our distance education population. This would allow us to schedule workshops at the appropriate time.
I wonder if that would be appropriate time, but also give you a sense of the topic, kind of if you're going to workshop. If I'm kind of assuming kind of how I'm interpreting when you say workshopping, it could be, you know, are we going to workshop, for instance, linear equations would probably be a very popular workshop at week 8 if you are in a college algebra course.
Supplemental instruction. Or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, that seems to be it at this point.
Okay. So I also asked the question of what additional data would you need? So I'm sure that you can think of all the data that you have on your end. What data would you need from whomever your provider might be for any kind of student support service, or you could think of like your own, like you have your own tutoring, like I think somebody responded with their own face-to-face tutoring. What additional data do you think we should be collecting that would be beneficial?
Okay, hold on. Let's see if this is from the previous. Also helps us to consider helping faculty to know what areas need more focus.
Okay.
So that's really back before on the other question. Okay, hold on. Look at data to see, was there a significant difference between the students who received tutoring than their peers in the course section who did not? So that would be a data point they'd want to look at. I think that's it, Cindy.
Okay. I would think some of the additional data that I think that's something that we do provide that I think could also play into this is there was from program pathways, they're wanting to know, the idea that how can we flag students early and do like an early alert, I guess is the language that could be used. And so as I mentioned, we have that diagnostic at the beginning in terms of the students that have reached, they have either reached understanding or they are missing prerequisite knowledge. And so I think it'd be interesting to also tie in not only those students who received and who did not receive, but then you can also take those that received, how many had prerequisite challenges but that went on to, what was their final grade? Or, did they go on and take the next course? I mean, all the ways in which you could measure that impact. I think that is something else that could be brought to the table to really look at a lot of ways which you could carve up the impact data that you would want to make with the use of the data. And then, so what additional analyses or studies would you complete with these data?
Here's some additional, Cindy, on number 2.
Okay.
Other variables, prior math history, academic standing, course unit load for the semester in which they're taking math, difference in tutoring, usage by these different variables, and also the student's background. Their demographics and what have you.
Mm-hmm.
GPA.
Again, that is data that institutions can have, and so once we can connect this data to the institutional data. Again, I think the ideas I get excited in terms of that evaluation part of my mind gets very excited in terms of what are all the different ways we could look at impact once we connect to the student data.
So under the third item, what be tracking student outcomes, looking at the students who use online tutoring and their current GPAs to determine what populations of students are using the tools. And what are the success rates? Tracking the courses by the students' different attributes. Took prior to these examples.
Okay, great. Any other additional analysis?
Looked like it.
So I wanted to kind of have an opportunity to gather your input, similar to how when we worked with Ivy Tech, we said, this is all we found. Like, what would you want to do with it? How would you want to dive into it? Not necessarily if this is the answer key, but these are the things that we recommended as next steps in conjunction with our partners. So for instance, they felt that they could use the data we presented for their course mapping of sequences. So looking at, what's going on in Math 100, is there a better, sequence we could be doing? I think that we really spent some time talking about analyzing the access points. As well as analyzing placement tools. So I think, some, state systems as well as, individual community colleges, this is a point that many are struggling with, is that there is open access. And so there aren't any placement tools. And so really, how could this data be helpful in understanding, students that are, starting out Math 136, that maybe they needed the Math 100 or the Math 23, but however, the placement tool put them in 136, or there is no placement tool. Some institutions are using different placement tools. So it's a way in which you could look at, how are some placement tools, where are they putting students, and which students are struggling, and in, what area. There are also, for those programs that are following a guided pathway plan, that they are setting up whole pathway learning objectives. And so another thing that was said is that they could include for their instructors these non-cognitive elements into the guided pathways plan. I think in terms of what Ivy Tech shared with us, there's a tendency to focus on the academic, but how do you get the affective aspects into the courses and into the instruction? And one way to do that is to set that as an overarching pathway goal. And so they're writing those into their goals. And then I think, as many of you had mentioned, as soon as we tie this data together, we're going to look at doing much more rigorous impact studies with them. In terms of course design, I think, as we saw, there could be some, if you look at your data and it's all over the place for college algebra, and maybe you want to implement a much more standard course sequence, because if you do, that will help with some of your course mapping, in terms of in the pathway, then that is an option that you could make, where you're seeing success in certain courses where the sequences are in a certain way. And as I mentioned earlier, the OER content. So if you are shifting to OER content, I think that is also something, and you don't have as much of the standard sequence, another way where you can be diving into where you're seeing student challenges. And also here, even at the course level, adding some of these non-cognitive elements to the learning outcomes. And then I think, as many of you mentioned, in terms of additional data, that we started really brainstorming the power of setting up some of these student profiles. So you could really analyze who's accessing, who's not, when are they accessing, do they access early and then trail off? And so there's so much that you could do with the student profiles. But then also, once you start looking at who is coming in for the student support, you could start tailoring the messaging to those student profiles in terms of what kind of messages are they getting at what point along the pathway, and even within the course. So all of these were next steps that were looked at with Ivy Tech. So I just wanted to pause here because we did go through a lot of information and had you, give a chance to kind of share out some of your ideas, but I wanted to also give you an opportunity to ask any questions.
So, Cindy, there have been some questions that have been asked throughout the webinar. One recent question really reflects back on what you were just talking about, non-cognitive support. Wanted you maybe to go into a little bit more depth on what we know about instructor non-cognitive support and how that might occur, engaging the student maybe out of the classroom, and whether that happens or not.
So am I interpreting the question of what would it look like kind of what would be the look-fors that you're looking for an instructor that would be engaging in that outside of classroom support? Is that correct?
That sounds like it, right?
Okay. So one of the things that, I would say that you're looking for is, especially kind of one of those things they found out is very malleable when you're looking at the non-cognitive, is all of these are very malleable, but one that can be taught is the growth mindset. And so that is, there are ways in which you can, you refer to successes and how you give praise. And so there's a lot of research on that in terms of, are they, praising the effort that is made and very specifically towards a task versus just, the outcome in general, like the grade or the outcome of the exam. There's also, I would say, one of the things that I would say that we see in our tutors, if I can kind of relate that to the instructor, is that they set up a roadmap very early in terms of what can be achieved. And so if you have the instructor, whether that could be just for the whole course, or that might be for any individual session, or it could just be for outside kind of the hours that they're having where they're working one-on-one with students, is they have a clear roadmap. Okay, what is the challenge you're having? This is how far we're going to get. This is our goal for the end. And they essentially set up the steps that they're going to make to get to that goal. And what's important for confidence is, I feel like they're a cheerleader, and you are sometimes celebrating every single accomplishment that student might have. And so that you are really, for some students, it may be, great, you're getting in there and you are trying to work on these, problems, and you got the first problem set done, well done. So you're kind of taking it in small pieces and finding encouragement in that way. And I would say that also another thing that our tutors do that I would say makes them very successful is it gives them if the student makes a mistake, it's not that you celebrate the mistake, but you're very encouraging and saying, okay, that's okay, let's just try that again. And it's let's us work on it together. And there isn't a you, but it becomes the we, and that you're in that classroom. And so that's another thing I would be looking for especially if they're working on one-on-one, is that they need to feel safe. And so that then also that teacher and that instructor is setting up an environment that encourages them to ask questions, to get them wrong, and to be, all right, no, let's just look at that from a different angle maybe, or, encouraging the peer groups and stuff like that. So I feel like there's a lot that could be done, and I hope I hit a few points in there that was helpful.
Yes. Also, do we know if these students come from a developmental math course into college algebra, or straight into college algebra? Do we have that data, or is that data that Ivy Tech has? That's
the data Ivy Tech would have. We could break it down in terms of, we can look at those students that were in the Math 23. That is a developmental math course. And so we could look at, specifically, that's analysis we haven't done yet, is look at where was the Math 23, which is the developmental level, versus the Math 100, which is that intermediate level, and do a comparison among those courses to see. What we don't have yet, but we could also then break down by the years, but again, we would need the Ivy Tech data because we did the 2015 through 2017, we could follow by semester those students that took 23 to 100 to Math 136 in 2017, we could probably follow those students, but we would need that student data to be able to do that.
Great. Early on, you mentioned the retention rate at Ivy Tech, and the question was that the retention rate for math, or was that the traditional retention rate, year 1 to year 2 retention?
I believe it was year 1 to year 2.
It was a traditional retention rate.
Yeah, traditional.
Right. Mm-hmm. And then there was a question about our system and whether it collects the time of day data for those receiving tutoring, and I can answer that. We certainly do collect that. We measure for all the subjects that we have and all the sessions that students have in those subjects, what time of day they're coming to us, along with the wait time and the length of the session as well. So there is some analysis you could do, I imagine, Cindy, on those that come, at a reasonable time of the day and those that come at midnight and later.
Yeah, I think it's also another pattern that we could see that is, we know how frequently they're coming. So you can also look at an individual student, within that linear algebra time, even though it said week 36, you have some students that probably came 3 or 4 times in, week 36, so that's another thing where you'd want to, and I guess that's an early alert that would be sent to that institution saying, this student has come in and they've asked for Algebra 2 help 4 times in 1 week, and a flag would be sent. Any other questions, Jim? Hello?
I'm sorry. There was one more question. I was muted. I apologize. Question about receiving, is there a full report on this, on the study? And yes, there is. And anybody can have that that asks us. We'll be happy to share that with you. Cindy, do you have a contact sheet here on slide?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So just email Cindy, or you can email me. I am the same sort of email convention, only it's jim.barnes, B-A-R-N-E-S, @tutor.com. And we will certainly forward to you the full study, co-authored between Cindy, Joan Rooney, and
Ben Markham.
Ivy Tech. Okay, I think that's it. So, thank you all for being a part of this. We really appreciate you joining us on this study, on this webinar. We hope it's been informative for you, and we as a company are committed to student success and making sure students not only are satisfied with the tutoring they receive from us, but that it actually leads to quantifiable student success results in terms of grades, persistence, retention, graduation. We thank you. Thank Dr. Farah for her time presenting this today. If there are further questions as you think about this, feel free to email us and we'll get right back to you. Thank you all and have a very nice day.
Thank you, everybody.